Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 6 of our class together. I am working my way through the alternative solutions papers, and so I think the majority of folks have already gotten some feedback on their papers and gotten a grade. The rest will be getting that grade and feedback no later than tomorrow morning. But I've made some good progress, and thank you to those of you who submitted it over the weekend. That gave me a little bit extra time to work on those and get those returned to you. And so trying to do them on a rolling basis. I'm almost there, so I almost have them all done. They were very good. I was very happy with the quality. What I was looking for is I was looking for solutions that made sense, that were feasible, and that could actually address the problem that you identified in your background paper. And that's essentially what I got. Some of the solutions may be somewhat costly in terms of resources. And if so, I may have made a comment in terms of where those resources going to come from. Is there a strategy to obtain those resources? But overall, all the papers were very good. And so I think everyone's in very good shape there. Your next written assignment then is the chosen solution paper, but that's not due until the 17th. And so you got some time to think about that and then be able to review whatever feedback I gave you on your alternative solutions paper. And then that hopefully will help you then consider which of those solutions or which combination of those solutions you will then select as the chosen solution for the problem. You have another Canvas essay that is coming due next week as well. Well, your initial post on Saturday and your responses to a classmate on Monday. And for that one, we're going to draw on the information from last week's session, these 4 models of organizational effectiveness. And what I'm asking you to do is to identify which models of effectiveness are used in your organization or whatever organization you have chosen to talk about. Identify those models and then consider, are there other models that might be more appropriate for the organization to use? And so all the same ground rules apply to this Canvas essay as apply to all of our previous ones. And again, everyone's doing a really nice job on the Canvas essays. And so you've been there, done that. And so I don't think there are any issues to be concerned about with the Canvas essays. So that's what we have coming up next. Tonight, what we are going to look at is we're going to look at the topic of motivation and the relationship between motivation and productivity and effectiveness. And so, how can we motivate our employees? What types of strategies, what types of theories are there that we can employ to motivate our employees so that they can perform at higher levels, be more productive, which hopefully will then lead us to higher levels of effectiveness as an organization, however we are measuring effectiveness. If we're measuring the goal attainment type of model, then hopefully higher levels of performance will then help us achieve those goals more readily. So tonight's about motivation. I know we've got a lot of slides, but we're not going to belabor a lot of those slides. And so we'll be able to move through those relatively quickly. We'll see how long it takes us to get through the information. If there's time remaining, then we'll do some breakout groups. If not, then we'll just maybe stop a little bit early tonight and then pick up with the groups then next week. So we'll see how things go and we'll see how we proceed. But before we get into our discussion of motivation, just are there any questions before we start talking about our topic for tonight? Okay. Then if not, I'm sure you've probably talked about motivation in other settings and other courses so far in the program, but like we do with everything else in this course, we'll take those topics and we'll then link them to effectiveness and talk about what they mean for organizational effectiveness, however the organization is measuring effectiveness, as we talked about last week. So I think we all have a really good idea of what motivation is and basic commonsensical idea of how higher levels of motivation can certainly make our organizations more effective. But just to kind of give us a common baseline in terms of a definition for motivation, with motivation, we've understood that there's a lot of literature that has been constructed looking at motivation in the public sector. And that literature has kind of shown us that there's really no true science of motivation. That really what motivation is it's much more of a craft than it is a science. which means that there are techniques, there are ideas, there are skills, there are insights, there are approaches that we can then take to enhance the motivational levels of our employees. But there really isn't a true science of motivation. And we also know, as we will talk about a little bit later on, that the constraining nature of government and the political environment makes it sometimes difficult for us to motivate our employees in the public sector. Last week, we kind of left off talking about this survey of federal employee engagement, and I walked you through some of the dimensions of that study. And a lot of that study is looking at employee engagement and employee motivation. And we saw that several of the indicators on that survey you had very high responses to. You had very positive responses to it. We went through all those positive responses, then we went through the most negative responses. But overall, the takeaway is that it appears that federal employees are relatively motivated in their organizations and in their positions. So even though the character of government and the political environment sometimes makes it challenging to motivate our employees, we do know that for the most part, public employees are highly motivated. Now, some literature has shown us that they may not be quite as motivated as their private sector counterparts, but any differences in motivational levels between private employees and public employees, those differences tend not to be statistically significant. There are differences, but the differences are not large enough to be statistically significant. So we're talking about motivation. We're essentially talking about trying to get our employees to work harder and exert more effort on a consistent basis. But we know the context of public organizations can make that difficult. We know that our organizations in the public sector tend to be highly complex organizations. They have highly complex structures. There's some redundancy that's built into the structures of public organizations. They tend to exhibit a lot of those classical characteristics of an organization in that they tend to have tall hierarchies and allow this unity of command and a scalar chain and span of control. And so they tend to be relatively complex and have a lot of rules and regulations that govern the way in which we deal with our employees. All those complexities can make it difficult for us to motivate our employees. We also are very well aware of the limitations that are placed upon certain types of incentives in the public sector. We know that we're very limited in terms of things like pay for performance and bonus pay, and if we want to reward someone to increase their salary, one of the primary ways we increase someone's salary is through a reclassification study. And that reclassification study can only occur if the substance and nature of the position has actually changed. If the substance and nature of the position has not changed, then it's going to be very difficult for us to justify a reclassification study to then move that position up in our position classification system to a higher pay band in order to pay those employees more. So we're very limited in terms of those external, extrinsic types of incentives. And at the end of our discussion tonight, we'll talk more about incentives. We'll talk about different types of incentives and some incentives that may work better in the public sector than things such as monetary types of incentives. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about goals and the development of goals. We talked about why we have ambiguous and vague goals in the public sector. Oftentimes, that goal ambiguity comes directly from the vague mandates and legislation passed out of legislative bodies. The more ambiguous, the more vague your goals are, the more difficult it is to motivate people to achieve those goals. We also know that when you have ambiguous and vague goals, then that also has implications for performance expectations. And it makes it more difficult for us to identify clear performance expectations. If you don't have those clear performance expectations, employees aren't going to know what's expected of them. And so therefore, that will have a negative impact upon their motivation as well. Sometimes there's this lack of cohesion in public organizations, that everyone doesn't feel they're really working toward the same goals. And that has an impact, a negative impact upon motivation. Then we also have environmental influences. And I've made mention to this book before in this class, The Case for the Bureaucracy by Charles Goodsell, published all the way back in 1970, where Goodsell talks about the negative view of the bureaucracy that many members of the public have. And he points out that this negative view of the bureaucracy is usually a function of their most recent interaction with the bureaucratic organization. So if their most recent interaction with a public agency was a negative interaction, then they're going to have a negative view of the bureaucracy. And if you were to go out there and ask members of the public, when you think of the word bureaucracy, what do you think of? They're going to say red tape. They're going to say impersonal. They're going to say inefficient, ineffective. It's going to be kind of hard. You'll be hard pressed to find positive adjectives to try and associate with bureaucracy among members of the public. This is obviously important for motivation because our public employees are always told by members of the public that bureaucracy is bad, your organizations are inefficient and ineffective, and by implication, you as an employee are also ineffective and inefficient. If you hear that day in and day out, obviously that's not going to have a very positive impact upon your motivational levels. So I think we have some unique aspects of the public sector that do make it uniquely difficult for us to motivate our employees. Motivation is, in essence, a person's desire to work hard and work well on a consistent basis. So motivation is someone's desire to put forth this effort on a consistent basis, to work hard and to work well consistently. That's usually what we consider to be motivation. So in order to get people to work harder and to work better and to do this on a consistent basis, we are going to have to think about some of the incentives and some of the strategies we can use to motivate these individuals. But before we can really get into some of the theories of worker motivation, I think we first must talk about how we measure motivation. How do we know that there is a problem with motivation in our organizations? And I know a couple of people in the alternative solutions paper, in the background paper, talked about motivation as a problem in their organizations. That in their organizations or the organization they're talking about, there's a lack of motivation among employees, and here are some of the reasons why. But in order to know if there's a lack of motivation and identify the reasons why and then develop strategies to address those reasons, we have to collect information directly from our employees. So the measurement of motivation tends to be inherently qualitative in nature. And so we're going to use some of our more qualitative types of measures, such as surveys and interviews and focus groups, in order to try and collect information that will tell us how motivated our employees really are. And so I think Rainey does a good job of breaking down for you some of the examples of surveys and questionnaires that have been used in the past to measure worker motivation in the public sector. One example is the job motivation scale. This job motivation scale is a questionnaire that poses the following questions. Question one, on most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? Obviously, if time is dragging for you, that's probably not a good indicator for your motivational level. Some people are completely involved in their job. They are absorbed in it night and day. For other people, their job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel in your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that isn't really required of you? Again, an indicator of motivation. Would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in your organization? Now, obviously, with some of the responses to these questions, we can anticipate somewhat of a situation of measurement error and measurement bias. Because if you ask someone if they're working harder, less hard, or about the same, obviously you're going to have this kind of halo effect where most people are going to say, oh, I'm working very hard. I'm working much harder than my colleagues in the organization. So this is one of those problems that we have with surveys and questionnaires, in that we are basing our results on the responses we're getting from human subjects. Those human subjects are sometimes not completely honest. in terms of the way they are answering those questions. And so all the problems that you talked about in research methods in terms of surveys and measurement bias, those same problems then affect these motivational surveys as well. The work motivation scale. I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. I am willing to start work early or stay late to finish a job. And then we have a reversed indicator. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my current job. Obviously, this is reversed because they agree with that, and that's going to be an indicator of low levels of motivation. As you know, when you construct surveys, you like to put in some of these reverse types of indicators as a kind of a check on the quality of the measurement that you're getting in the responses from your subjects. I do extra work for my job that isn't really expected of me. And then another reverse indicator, time seems to drag while I'm on the job. The more time drags, obviously, the less likely you are to be motivated. Intrinsic motivation scale. In this one, we are looking at the motivating effects of the work itself with questions such as, when I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. And so, as you know, with surveys, whenever you have these statements, you'll then usually attach like or ordinal response scales to them. So, strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and strongly disagree. So even though we refer to them as questions, they're really in the form of a statement attached to a like or ordinal response scale. So I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth and development. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do my job well, and doing my job well increases my self-esteem. So this is kind of getting us back into the human resource management theorists, getting us kind of back into Abraham Maslow, as well as Douglas McGregor, in terms of the intrinsic feeling that people get from doing their job and doing their job well. Reward expectations type of survey. Some surveys, such as Federal Employment Attitude Survey, we looked at that last week, uses questions about reward expectations. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for higher pay, true or false. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for promotion, true or false. And when we looked at the study last week, we saw that this is where we saw some relatively low scores coming from respondents, and a lot of respondents felt that the quality of the work was not correlated strongly with the chances for higher pay or the chances for promotion. Karen asked a really good question in text chat. Are some surveys completed anonymously? Do organizations prefer to know who is completing the survey? Typically, these are done anonymously, so you want to grant subjects both anonymity as well as confidentiality in order to increase those response rates. The problem is if you lack the anonymity, then people feel that their responses could then get them in trouble, and there could be some retribution for some negative attitudes about the organization, the work of the organization. So we usually try and grant both anonymity and confidentiality. There could be some situations where the organization does want to be able to track these answers back to perhaps divisions, back to units within the organization, so to compare divisions and units to each other in terms of these indicators for motivation. That's oftentimes done. That will erode a little bit of anonymity. You can always, though, in research, pretty much guarantee confidentiality. Even though you cannot always guarantee anonymity, you can almost always guarantee confidentiality. That the responses that you get will be held confidential and that they'll be used only for the purposes of this research, of this study. We can also do some peer evaluations of individual work motivation. So we can ask peers to evaluate their peers and ask them to evaluate their peers in terms of team attitude, task concentration, their independence, and their ability to be a self-starter, organizational identification, how well they identify with the organization and organizational goals, job curiosity. So are they curious about delving deeper into their jobs or some other jobs within the organization? Or are they just doing what Frederick Taylor refers to as soldiering? and they're just doing as little as they can on a daily basis in their current jobs just to get the job done. Persistence, professional identification, again, these are all indicators you can look at in a peer-to-peer type of an evaluation. So we've got a lot of different options at our disposal in terms of trying to measure the motivation of our workforce. But first, we have to measure motivation to see how motivated our workforce is before we can then ask the question, well, what are some of the causes of lower levels of motivation? And then what can we do? What strategies can we use to then address those causes of lower levels of motivation? But even though we're talking about motivation tonight, we also have to add the caveat that we understand motivation alone does not determine performance. It is a good example of a necessary but not sufficient explanation. So it's necessary for people to be motivated in order to perform well, but it's not the sole reason why people perform well or perform poorly. We know there are other factors that have an impact on performance. Obviously, the ability of that employee to do the job, the training the employee has, the amount of preparation the employee has for doing their job, and the employee's perceptions about their ability to perform the job. This, when we talk about Vroom's expectancy theory a little bit later on, this is what we would consider to be an expectancy. So how much confidence do they have that they are able to perform this job up to the expectations of that position? We know there are other factors as well. And so there can be psychological factors. There could be if there's something negative going on in that person's life outside of the organization, that could certainly have an impact upon their performance. If there are health concerns, that can have an impact upon their performance as well. And so there are a whole lot of other things that can impact performance. So motivation is a necessary but not sufficient predictor of employee performance. But it is an important enough predictor of employee performance that we spend an entire week in this class looking at work motivation. So, as we said, there is a wealth of literature out there that looks at this idea of work motivation and has developed theories to try and explain why some employees are motivated, why others are not motivated. These theories can kind of be broken up into two primary categories: content-based theories and process-based theories. Content-based theories of motivation are concerned with analyzing the needs, the motives, and the rewards of individual employees that affect motivation. So they kind of look at the content of motivation. What is actually motivating people? And that's what we consider to be a content-based type of theory. Process-based theories look at the psychological and behavioral processes that underlie motivation. And so that's where we're going to get into a discussion of people like Bandura and people like Locke and those other folks. So content, we're actually looking at what truly motivates people, the content of motivation. Then process-based theories, we're looking more at the psychological processes that underpin the motivation of employees. So we're dividing our theories up into those two different categories. So for our first category of content-based theories, we have some very familiar authors listed here on the screen that you're very well acquainted with. People like Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, Douglas McGregor and his theory X and theory Y. We've talked about both of those previously in this class. Herzberg and his two-factor theory, the differentiation between motivators and hygiene factors that I know you've covered in other courses in the program. And then McClellan and what we call the needs-based model. This is one that oftentimes doesn't get quite as much exposure in an MPA program. So I don't know if you've come across it before, but it's a very good theory. It's a very compelling theory. It just doesn't really get covered quite as much as the first three theories. So we all know Maslow. We talked about Maslow a few weeks ago. So we know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got these 5 different levels of needs. The bottom levels are deficiency needs. Self-actualization is the growth need. And so people are motivated in the bottom 4 needs by having a deficiency in one of these needs. So they're motivated to try and fulfill this deficiency. Once that deficiency in that need is filled, then it ceases to be a motivator, and then you move on to a different need within that hierarchy of needs. So at those bottom levels, employees are being motivated by a deficiency in those needs. At the top level, self-actualization, that's a growth motivator. So they are being motivated by the desire to grow, to self-actualize, to end up trying to be all that they can be and develop themselves as much as they can as human beings. So Maslow contributes to our understanding of motivation through content, giving us these different types of needs, and then how filling these needs can then help motivate employees. Douglas McGregor, who we also talked about a few weeks ago in Theory X and Theory Y. Douglas McGregor, big believer in Abraham Maslow, also then contributes to our understanding of motivation by saying that employees are motivated by these higher order needs. They're motivated by self actualization, they're motivated to try and grow. As Chris Archer says, people go through this personal growth trajectory as they mature. And so it's up to the organization to help those employees move through that personal growth trajectory. So you motivate employees by providing them with opportunities to move along their personal growth path. So you motivate them by designing jobs that are interesting, that will allow these employees to enhance their accountability and their responsibility levels. Job enrichment, as we talked about, is one of the main strategies in Theory Y management, where we allow people to participate in the enrichment of their job so that they can help determine what types of things and what types of skills they're going to be developing on a daily basis that will then contribute to their growth as a human resource. So McGregor and Mayo both are telling us, this is what employees need, and this is what the organization needs to do in order to help motivate their employees. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment. Isn't it a little bit hard in the public sector to design opportunities for civil servants because everything is pretty much laid out, and then in civil servants you have to be really careful not to work the person out of classification. So it just makes it really, really hard to really design in the public sector. Would
And
you agree?
I would
Yeah.
absolutely agree with you. That's a great point. And we do have this position classification system, and so you cannot have people working outside their job description, working outside their classification. So what we need to do is we need to incorporate this then into a reclassification study. And so if you have an employee who wants to develop their skills, I'll give you an example. I had a administrative support coordinator. They're called ASCs at my university, and that person was in an ASC1 position. As an ASC1, that person did not have any opportunities to advise students. And this is a person who wanted to get involved in advising students and working with students, but their current classification, their position did not allow that. But it's something that we wanted them to do. It's something that they were kind of doing a little bit on their own because that's something they want to grow into a position of being an advisor. And so we did a reclassification study, and we had the job analysis, and we had HR came over. They shadowed the person. They looked at what the person was doing. They talked to the person about what they wanted to achieve in their career. And they came to determination that this position actually should be reclassified as a ASC2. And an ASC2 then has within the job description advising of students. And so that then allowed this person to advise students in their new job classification, came with a pay bump as well, but it allowed them then to enrich their job and do these types of activities that would help them develop those skills. So you're exactly right. It's difficult in the civil service system to do a lot of this job enrichment outside of a class reclassification study or some type of job analysis that will allow us to incorporate these types of things into their job description. It's much more difficult to do it in the public sector than it is obviously in the private sector. The private sector, you can just say, here, start doing this, and they start doing that. And so it's much easier in the private sector. So you're exactly right. But there are some instances where you can certainly do this through reclassification. The problem with reclassification, though, is that it's a slippery slope. And once you reclassify someone's position, then someone else in the organization is going to say, I want to be reclassified as well. That I'm doing more than what my position description says I should be doing. And then it just ends up again being this slippery slope where everyone then wants a reclassification, because you get your job reclassed, that means you're going to make more money. And so sometimes people want reclassifications where don't they really don't qualify for that reclassification. We had that situation when I was on the board in the school district where we had people saying, well, I'm kind of working outside my classification because I'm doing these types of things as a classified aide or whatever the case may be. And so we would reclassify, we do a classification study, we reclassify that position. And then the other classified employees would hear about it, and then they would want to be reclassified. And then, so what we ended up doing is we ended up doing a organization-wide reclassification study. And that organization-wide reclassification study took us over a year to do, where we went back, we looked at all the classified positions in the school district and looked at what they were doing, did a job analysis for each one of them, and then used the results of that for reclassification. That's a huge process. That's a very expensive process. And so, yeah, there are a lot more obstacles and hurdles to do this in the public as compared to the private sector. But hopefully, once you do it, then it's going to hold for a while, and then you won't have to do this every single year. This is something you do. I think the last time we had a real scale classification study of the whole organization was long before I was on the board. It was maybe 20 years prior, and so it doesn't happen frequently because it is so time consuming and so costly. It's really going to wrap up a lot of the time of your HR professionals in doing this reclassification as well. Herzberg, you've probably been introduced to Herzberg before in the MPA program, in Herzberg's two-factor theory. And so Herzberg tells us that essentially motivators are not all created equal. There are some things that are motivators, such as somebody's interest in their work, interest in higher levels of achievement. Those kind of intrinsic incentives are what Herzberg refers to as motivators. Extrinsic incentives, such as rewards, pay for performance, those he refers to as hygiene factors. The argument of Herzberg is that hygiene factors are not motivators. They do not motivate employees to achieve higher levels of performance. What hygiene factors can do is they can prevent job dissatisfaction. But it's really these motivators, these intrinsic incentives, that are what are essential to increasing worker motivation. So extrinsic hygiene factors prevent dissatisfaction. Intrinsic motivators are what will then contribute to higher levels of motivation among our employees. So this is, this classic dichotomy between intrinsic and extrinsic incentives, and just how important extrinsic incentives are in the public sector compared to the private sector. Typically, a lot of our literature says that extrinsic incentives are more important in the private sector. Intrinsic incentives are much more important than in the public sector. And then McClellan, which again doesn't get quite as much play in MPA programs as it should, McClellan presents us with three types of motivational needs: achievement motivation, authority, power motivation, and affiliation motivation. According to McClellan, for employees, the primary motivator is achievement motivation. And achievement motivation he defines as a dynamic restlessness to achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by using one's own ability and effort. People are motivated to achieve as employees are motivated to achieve. Employers are much more motivated by developing power and developing authority. So we consider McGregor, we consider Herzberg to be more content-based theories. And so we're talking about Mayo, we're talking about McGregor, we're talking about Herzberg and McClellan. We're looking more at the content of what motivates an employee as opposed to the process. We get to the process-based theorists, we're going to talk about people like Vroom, we'll talk about people like Bandura, goal setting by Locke. Those are much more process-oriented. These are more content, looking at what actually motivates individual employees. So employees are much more motivated by the achievement motivator, whereas employers are much more motivated by the desire to have authority and to have power over others. So, to compare these four different content based theories of motivation, the chart on the screen kind of does that for you, comparing Maslow to McGregor to Herzberg to McClellan. So, if you're looking at the deficiency needs in terms of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, so you're looking down at it should be physiological needs, safety needs, uh, needs for love, needs for belonging, and to a little bit less of an extent, self-esteem needs. Those correlate with McGregor's theory X classical types of organizations. So that's kind of more of a theory X type of orientation. That's more what Herzberg referred to as the hygiene factors. And it also then correlates with McClellan's power and affiliation motivators. Power motivator, how well you can influence others and the ability to influence others. Affiliation motivator, kind of this exchange of warm feelings between people. So the bottom level, Maslow hierarchy of needs correlates with theory X, correlates with hygiene factors, correlates with the power and the affiliation motivators of McClellan. Once you get to the top of Mayo and you're looking at the self-actualization, that's going to obviously correlate more with McGregor's theory Y, this desire for growth and development, more with Herzberg's intrinsic motivators, and align more with the achievement motivation theory of McClellan. So it just kind of gives you a way to compartmentalize and see how each of these four different content-based theories really kind of relate to each other. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I'm thinking like in terms of motivation, I know that when people are feeling valued and respected within their work, they're more motivated for and do a great job in performance, right? Where is this more of a content-based theory or is it more a process-based theory?
Yeah, I would put it more in the content-based category because this is what
Mhm.
is motivating them. What's motivating them is their feeling that they, of self-esteem, that they're held in high esteem by others, by their peers and their colleagues. That's kind of what is motivating them. If it's what is actually motivating them, I would put that more in the content-based type of category.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Sure. When we are looking at these content-based theories, equity is a very important issue because the more people feel that they are being treated equitably, that these the motivators are being spread, distributed equally around the organization, the more likely they are to be motivated. As Chester Barnard would tell us, there is kind of this transactional relationship between employees and employers. In that transactional relationship, in order to be successful, leaders and managers must extract contributions from their employees. They extract contributions from their employees by providing those employees with selective incentives. So the contributions that employees give are what are considered to be the job inputs. And then what they are then getting in terms of these incentives are the job outputs. People need to feel that there's at least a balance between what they're contributing to the organization and then what they are getting out of the organization. And so examples of job inputs, as you can see here on this Adams equity theory scale, are things such as the amount of time they put into their job, the effort they put into their job, their their abilities that they bring to the job, the flexibility they bring to their job, their commitment to the job and the organization, their honesty, their collegiality, their heart, their integrity, the respect they have for their colleagues in the organization. Those are all inputs that employees bring to their jobs on a daily basis. Then the outputs that they're getting from the organizations are things like the paycheck that they get, the benefits they receive, vacation time, job security, recognition by leaders and managers, the responsibility they have at the organization, respect that they are being treated with. the sense of purpose that they have from doing their job in the organization, the sense of achievement they get from doing their job in the organization. Those are all outputs that they are getting. And so, commonsensically, if they perceive that they are putting in more contributions than they are getting in job outputs, they're putting more in inputs than they're getting in outputs, that's what's going to lead to reduced effort. That's what's going to lead to reduced commitment, and all those good things you hope your employees will have for the organization give to the organization. Those contributions will then end up being minimized and being lessened because they feel that the inputs are greater than the outputs that they are getting. So, as Chester Barnard would tell us, we really do need to find this balance in this transactional relationship between our employees and our organization. Another aspect of equity is in terms of the idea of justice, organizational justice. And this kind of serves as a nice bridge from our content-based theories into our process-based theories. So, in terms of the justice in the organization, there are two aspects to justice. There's what's called distributive justice and what's called procedural justice. Distributive justice looks at the employee's perception of the fairness and equity in the distribution of rewards across the organization. So, does this employee feel that they are getting an equitable, a fair amount of rewards as compared to other people in the organization? How are these rewards basically, how are they distributed, and do you feel that you are getting the rewards that you have earned compared to other people in the organization? When we looked at the study of the federal government last week, we saw that was a problem at the federal level. That we had a lot of employees saying that they were not getting the equitable amount of rewards as compared to their colleagues and their peers. Procedural justice looks at the fairness with which people feel that they are treated by the organizational processes. So, the processes in the organization of giving out these rewards, how fair is that process? They need to feel that there's both distributive justice in terms of it's fair and who gets what, and they also have to feel that they're being treated fairly by the process that is used in giving out those rewards and giving out those incentives. When people have a higher level we feel that there's a higher level of justice in an organization, that is going to be strongly correlated with positive work-related attitudes, which is then strongly correlated with higher levels of motivation, which hopefully will then be strongly correlated with organizational effectiveness. So we're kind of really looking very much at this, what we would call in statistics, a path model of statistics, and that we have this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this. Then we also have what we call our process-based models. And the process-based models will then look at the process by which we are motivating our employees. So rather than look at the content of necessarily what motivates the employees solely, now we're looking more at the process of how we go about motivating our employees. And in this category of process-based theories, we have theories such as Vroom's expectancy theory. We reach into the world of psychology for Skinner and operant conditioning and reinforcement, Bandura's social learning cognitive theory, and then Locke's goal setting theory as four prominent process-based theories of motivation. You've probably been introduced to Vroom's theory before. I think we mentioned it in a previous class session, but Paul Vroom's expectancy theory is one that I like a lot, not because it's something that employees sit down and actually calculate out these expectancies on a daily basis, but in a little bit more of a subjective manner. I think that expectancy theory makes a lot of sense in terms of how we motivate employees. So the primary claim in Vroom's expectancy theory is that an individual considering an outcome will sum up all the values of those outcomes that will result from an action, and then will weight each of those outcomes according to the probability of it happening. Essentially, this is a rational, self-interested based type of theory. So it's kind of this classic utilitarian type of an approach. in that people will maximize pleasure and minimize pain, that they will maximize their benefits while trying to minimize their costs. So in Vroom's expectancy theory, there are three main concepts that underpin how we motivate our employees. One of those concepts is what's called valence. Valence refers to the emotional orientation that people hold with respect to outcomes and rewards. Basically, how much do they value those potential outcomes and rewards? So, how much do they value flexibility? How much do they value an additional challenge? How much do they value being employee of the week or employee of the month? So, how much value do they place upon these possible outcomes that will accrue from them putting forth this amount of effort? So if I put forth this effort, here's the outcome I expect. How much do I value that outcome? This will differ depending upon employee. Some employees might value being employee of the month. Other employees may not care one bit about being employee of the month. If they don't care about that award, that recognition, then it's not going to motivate them. So that's valence. How much weight do they place on each of these potential outcomes? Then you have a second concept of expectancy, and this really speaks to the confidence that employees have in their capabilities. So, do employees expect that if I put forth this amount of effort, that the result of putting forth this amount of effort is that I will achieve this performance level that I want to achieve? How likely is that? If they're not very confident that putting forth the effort will result in this outcome of this performance level, then chances are they're not going to put that effort in. So how confident are they in terms of their abilities? And then the third concept is instrumentality. Instrumentality refers to the perception among employees that these outcomes or these rewards will actually result, that management will make good on these promises, that if you get this project done, then in time, then you're going to get this type of recognition, whatever that recognition is. So how much faith do they have in management to carry through all these promised types of rewards? So you think about a situation, a really simple situation where you have a report that needs to get done. And we're going to oversimplify this, but a report that needs to get done. And so an employee thinks, I need to get this report done by Monday morning. So here I am on Friday. In order to get this report done, the effort that I'll have to put in is I will have to come in and work on Saturday. I'll have to come in and work on the weekend in order to get this report done. That's the effort that I would have to put in. The performance level is getting the report done. So how confident am I that if I come in and work on the weekend, I will be successful at getting this report done by 9 a.m. on Monday morning? How confident am I in that? Then what's the outcome? So if I do get this report done by Monday morning, what kind of reward, what type of outcome will I get? Will I get a feeling of achievement that I got this report done? Will I get recognition from my manager, my supervisor? What type of outcome will I get? And then how much do I value that outcome? How much do I value that reward? So the basic Vroom formula, and again, we're not going to say that employees sit down and get out their calculator and calculate this out, but in a more general sense, their effort is going to be determined by, you see, the E to P, and the E to P means the probability that a certain level of effort will result in a certain level of performance. So the probability that if I come in and work on the weekend, that I will get this report done by Monday morning. Am I 100% confident? Am I 60% confident? Am I 30% confident? How confident am I that this level of effort will then lead to this level of performance or productivity? Then the P to O is how confident am I that if my level of performance, I hit this level of performance of getting the report done by Monday morning, how confident am I that this will then result in this outcome, this reward of whatever the reward may be, being a declared employee of the week or whatever it is? How confident am I that this outcome will accrue from this level of performance? And then the V stands for the valence level. How much weight, how much emphasis do I place upon this projected outcome? So the idea in Vroom's theory is that employees, in determining how much effort to put forth, how much effort to exert, they'll look at how confident they are that that effort will lead to a certain performance level, how confident they are that if they achieve that performance level, it will then result in this reward or this outcome, and then how much value do they then place on that outcome or that reward. So the implications here for managers in motivation is that managers need to consider these three main factors in Vroom's expectancy theory of balance, expectancy, and instrumentality. Managers must understand what individual employees value, what types of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards will motivate that employee. So if they don't value being employee of the week, that's not going to motivate them to put forth that effort. Managers then also have to understand expectancy. How much confidence does the employee have in their ability to achieve this performance level by putting in this amount of effort? And then they have to understand instrumentality, that managers need to understand that if those performance levels are met, it is incumbent upon those managers to then provide those promised outcomes and those promised rewards. That's what we refer to as instrumentality. So they need to essentially use balance, use expectancy, and use instrumentality in order to motivate their employees. So what we essentially do from kind of a social science perspective is we're trying to assess the relationships between expectancy, between instrumentality, between balance, and the amount of effort that an employee is going to put forth to trying to accomplish a task. So I think that, again, we're not going to see employees sit down and calculate these percentages, these probabilities, but we are going to see these as factors that employers are going to take into account when they decide how much effort to exert. The amount of effort they exert is then how we are defining their motivational levels. So this is why this is one of those more process-based theories, because we are looking at the process by which we are motivating individual employees. I like Vroom's theory a lot just because, again, it makes some rational sense to us as social scientists and social science researchers, in that we are looking at the relationship between variables. It is very much of a linear type of a model, in that you have to look at their their expectancies, you have to look at instrumentalities, you have to look at balance. So it does tend to be kind of this linear type of almost regression model that we can then use to predict the amount of effort that employees will put forth into a job. So that's one process-based model, Vroom's expectancy theory. Another process-based model comes to us from the world of psychology, and you've probably heard of B.F. Skinner before. But B.F. Skinner is probably most known for his theory of operant conditioning. And in operant conditioning, we assume that people will behave based upon consequences that they receive. So if there are certain types of behaviors that receive certain types of consequences versus other types of consequences, that will then motivate them to behave in certain types of ways. The idea here is that when there are consequences that we do not like, then we will drop those behaviors. So if this behavior is leading to a consequence I do not like, then hopefully I will then be conditioned to drop that behavior. So if showing up to work late is something that will then be punished, and I'm getting a consequence I do not want by showing up late for work, if that consequence seems severe enough to me, then I will extinguish the behavior of showing up late for work so I can then avoid that consequence. So the theory of operant conditioning is that managers and leaders will use consequences in order to try and form the behavior of their employees. The problem with operant conditioning is that sometimes we are predisposed to use negative consequences, negative reinforcements. And one thing that we know in operant conditioning is that positive reinforcements tend to work better and are more effective at molding and shaping behavior than negative reinforcements and punishment. So you're oftentimes much better using positive reinforcement as opposed to negative consequences. The process of how you provide this reinforcement and how you provide these consequences also makes a difference in terms of how quickly people will start exhibiting a behavior and internalize a behavior you want them to internalize. So, operant conditioning essentially tells us that one of the most effective ways of providing these consequences or these reinforcements is through what is called an intermittent reinforcement schedule. In an intermittent reinforcement schedule, you will provide this reinforcement at very highly variable intervals. So you'll have it won't be predictable to the employee. So these reinforcements will come at kind of unpredictable times for these employees. Reinforcement after long varying periods oftentimes will require more time for the individual employee to acquire the behavior, but that individual employee is much more likely to keep that behavior with this intermittent reinforcement schedule. If you're using a reinforcement schedule that is very predictable, those predictable reinforcement schedules tend to not be very lasting in terms of behavior acquisition. Same type of thing if you are using a very frequent reinforcement. The more frequent the reinforcement, sometimes the more immune the employer gets to that reinforcement, employee gets to that reinforcement, and so it kind of ceases to then shape behavior. So using this kind of surprising intermittent reinforcement, highly variable reinforcement schedule in operating conditioning oftentimes better shapes the behavior on the part of employees. But this obviously is a process-based type of theory because we were talking about the process of providing these reinforcements in order to shape behavior so that hopefully employees will continue to pursue these behaviors that are positive, if you will, for the organization and organizational effectiveness. So Skinner kind of looks at these external types of consequences and reinforcements and how these external reinforcements can then shape employee behavior. Bandura is our third process-based theory, and Bandura looks more at what we call social learning theory. So Albert Bandura says that we're going to look more internal to the employee, and we're going to look at how that employee learns how to behave by essentially viewing others, by essentially being within this environment and watching how others behave, watching how behavior is rewarded among other people. They will then learn from that, and they will then, in a more cognitive way, learn how to then behave by seeing how behaviors are done by others, essentially. So instead of Skinner, which looked at these external, extrinsic types of consequences and reinforcements, Bandura looks more internally at the cognitive learning process of those individual employees. So it really looks at the forms of learning and behavior changes that are not really coming from these external types of reinforcements, looking more at how people process the information that they see and then how they learn from that information. So the primary claim in social learning theory is that people will learn in a variety of ways other than through extra reinforcement. So instead of just learning through reinforcement and consequences, people will learn by modeling the behavior of others. So they'll look at what other people are doing and they'll then model their behavior after those other individuals. They will model the behavior through vicarious experiences. So they'll live vicariously through other people. They may not have to go through the trauma that this person is going through, but if they live through it vicariously, then they can learn from that trauma. So you do this vicarious type of learning. People learn through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so I don't know if you've ever had to do a major presentation. Sometimes you will rehearse that over and over in your mind so that you are ready to give that presentation. You're learning how to give that presentation more effectively. That's a cognitive process internal to the individual. And people will set goals for themselves, and then they will self-manage the achievement of those goals. They will learn what helps them achieve this goal, what does not help them achieve this goal, and they will then act accordingly. So the big difference again between Skinner and Bandura is Skinner is talking about here are these consequences, here are these external reinforcements to then shape behavior. Bandura is saying, no, we don't really shape behavior through these reinforcements, these external consequences, but rather we shape behavior internally. We have people learn how to shape their own behavior through these vicarious experiences, modeling behavior of others, and so on and so on. So it's a much more internal process, whereas Skinner was a much more external type of process. But goals are obviously important for motivation. And so our fourth theory comes to us from Edwin Locke. And Edwin Locke has what's called the goal setting theory. And it's a pretty simple theory. And the theory simply states that difficult goals tend to lead to higher levels of motivation, higher performance than easy goals, no goals, or vague goals. So we kind of talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that whenever we establish goals. We have official goals. We have goals that are kind of those goals along the way. Those kind of what Robert Ben would call the management by groping along the operant goals. And so those official goals, those long-term goals, are oftentimes extremely difficult to achieve. It can lead to some frustration, but the more difficult those goals are to achieve, the more they will push people toward trying to achieve those goals. There is another theory that comes from the world of physics that I like a lot that is called field theory. And field theory says that people are motivated by unaccomplished tasks. So whenever you have a task that you're trying to accomplish, if that task remains unaccomplished, you are going to be motivated in order to try and accomplish that task. That unaccomplished task kind of creates a tension in your field of forces. And what you are trying to do is you are then motivated to try and release that tension by accomplishing that task. So if it is a very difficult goal that is difficult to accomplish, the unaccomplished goal is going to create tension. And the only way to release that tension is by accomplishing that goal. In my life, it's kind of like grading assignments. And I kind of see assignments that pop up in our Canvas site. And that's an unaccomplished goal, is to get those assignments graded. And so if I need to stay up to 4 in the morning, I'm going to stay up to 4 in the morning, and I'm going to evaluate those assignments, because that's what releases then that tension of unaccomplished goals. So creating these difficult goals will then place this pressure on individual employees to work harder and be motivated to work toward the achievement of those unaccomplished goals. Goals are important in motivating employees. They're important because, as we talked a couple of weeks ago, they can direct the attention on the employee in terms of what needs to be done. They are important because they will intensify the efforts of employees in order to try and accomplish those unaccomplished goals. They have the ability to intensify the persistence, that people will persist with trying to accomplish this goal until that goal is accomplished. And difficult goals can also then spark creativity in problem solving. That if this isn't working to help us accomplish this goal, let's be creative and come up with another way of trying to accomplish the goal. The assignment of difficult goals enhances performance because it really does appeal to the individual's motivation to and desire to try and achieve and to accomplish those unaccomplished goals. They kind of give us this sense of purpose, and they give us standards for then evaluating performance. If we did not have goals, or if we had very vague and ambiguous goals, it would be incredibly difficult for us to come up with operational definitions of what is considered good performance versus what is not considered to be good performance. Goal setting obviously needs to be something that's done with the support of management. I know a few people in your papers are talking about the goals of the organization and are talking about reorienting the goals of the organization. So this information is probably very germane to you. So it's important when we set goals that we have the support of leadership and management. We also know that the greater the success, the greater the satisfaction. So the paradox, as we had talked about before, is that more difficult goals are less likely to be achieved, which at least initially in the short term will leave people unsatisfied. But that lack of satisfaction in turn will then foster ambition and then will push people to strive to achieve further and to finally achieve those unaccomplished goals. So difficult goals oftentimes are a good predictor for motivation. Goals that mix qualitative and quantitative oftentimes work well in terms of motivation as well, and assigning responsibility to people for the achievement, the accomplishment of those goals. If no one is held responsible, if no one is accountable for the achievement of the goals probably will not be achieved. Another recommendation for goal setting for motivation: empower employees to develop strategies and tactics for achieving goals. The more that you have employees developing the strategies for achieving those goals, the more motivated they will be to implement those strategies to achieve those goals, the more buy-in they will have in terms of those strategies. As we said, effective leadership and management is necessary, and we need a lot of feedback. We need to have a feedback loop. That feedback loop in our goal achievement is what is going to lead to higher levels of motivation and effort. People who are accountable for achieving these goals need to be committed to those goals. Managers and leaders need to stress how important the goals are and that these goals are eventually going to be attainable. And you need to try and avoid goal overload. If you have a multitude of goals that you are trying to work toward, that's going to have a negative impact upon your motivation because it's going to be very frustrating. You're going to have those goals conflicting with each other. So try and clearly identify important goals for the organization, allow people to participate in developing the strategies to achieve those goals, which will then empower those individuals to be more motivated to work toward the achievement of those goals. So according to Locke, the process of establishing goals has a major impact upon the motivational levels of our employees. The more difficult the goals, the more challenging the goals, typically the more motivated our employees are to work toward the achievement of those goals. So up to this point in time, we've identified 4 content-based theories, 4 process-based theories of motivation. It's just kind of a snapshot of kind of what the motivational theory looks like. But we do know the motivational literature doesn't really have any conclusive explanation of motivation. We can't say that, well, this theory is 100% accurate in motivating employees. It's kind of a mix and match between these different theories. It's important for us to recognize that just like the overall public administration literature says there is no longer a one-size-fits-all approach, the literature on motivation also says that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach either. We need to find the approaches that are appropriate for the situation that we find ourselves in. The literature calls for separate motivational theories to apply in different types of settings. The search for one universal motivational theory is a fruitless search. So where the literature is going now is the development of taxonomies, basically developing a taxonomy of, in this situation, this motivational theory is more appropriate than this theory. In this situation, this motivational theory tends to be more successful than this motivational theory. So even though the literature on motivation is somewhat disjointed, we do recognize that motivating employees is a complex and difficult process, and it really depends upon what you're trying to achieve, the goals you're trying to achieve, and the wants, needs, and desires, the balances of the individual employees, as well as their confidence levels. So different theories work better in different types of situations. Unfortunately, when we talk about motivation, we oftentimes talk about motivation in terms of compensation. We'll just motivate people by giving them higher levels of compensation by incorporating a pay for performance program into our organizations. As we said before, that's extremely difficult to do in the public sector. Linking rewards, especially extrinsic rewards of performance, is highly challenging in the public sector. For what was mentioned before, our civil service systems, our personnel procedures, makes it more difficult. Also, not all government agencies are the same. So we have seen some pay for performance plans meet with success in the public sector, while the majority have not met with success. The more you have an organization that is along the lines of a government corporation that generates a profit, perhaps the more likely you are to be able to use pay for performance. The more unionized your employees are, the more you are tied to not just a collective bargaining agreement, but also civil service regulations, the more difficult it is to use those types of extrinsic rewards, such as compensation. Findings really are kind of conflicting as to whether or not government employees perceive a connection between extrinsic rewards like compensation and performance. And I think, again, it's because it's really kind of a situational type of situation. We do know that unions tend to be somewhat standoffish when it comes to pay for performance because they feel that it really is kind of a slippery slope. And once you go down that slippery slope, then there's really no coming back from it. And so unions oftentimes don't like to see pay for performance incorporated in our pay systems, our civil service systems. The common perception is that public employees tend to be less motivated than their private sector counterparts. Now, we saw in our discussion of that survey last week that for the most part, federal employees tend to be highly motivated. It's just that when you compare them to their private sector counterparts, they're not quite as motivated. So both private as well as public sector employees are highly motivated. There's just private sector employees tend to report higher levels of motivation, but it's not a statistically significant difference in motivational levels between the different sectors. So, despite all the constraints and all the frustrations in the public sector and all the limitations on motivating employees, it seems like our public employees still tend to be highly motivated. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about intrinsic and extrinsic incentives and how they can have an impact upon motivation. So I hate to mention Chester Barnard again, but we're going to mention Chester Barnard again because Chester Barnard contributes to this discussion of the motivational aspect of incentives by creating for us this categorization of what he considers to be worker specific incentives versus non worker specific incentives. So in worker specific incentives, we are looking at things such as material, non-material. So it can be things like compensation. It could be things such as recognitions, such as Employee of the Week. It could be things such as improving work conditions. Those are all incentives that will affect individual worker and individual employee. But then there's another set of incentives that are not really geared toward an individual employee, but instead kind of apply to the entire organization as a whole. So things such as freedom from hostility, comfortable customary practices in the workplace. Those are all non-worker specific in that they don't specifically focus on one worker, but rather they apply to everyone within the general organization. Cynthia says, could it be that private sector workers are more motivated because they have more perks and have less red tape? I agree. I mean, it's easier and quicker to get things done in the private sector than it is in the public sector. And I know a couple of people were talking about procurement as one of the things they're focusing on and trying to come up with strategies to streamline procurement and to streamline contracting. If you deal with any type of public contracting, you have to deal with California Public Contract Code. You know all the hoops that you have to jump through in terms of contracting. And you know about the competitive bidding process, you know about responsive and responsible bidders, and all these things that you have bid protests, and all these things you have to go through in the contracting process that you don't have to go through in the private sector. So it does create a lot of frustration if you're trying to get a project done. It's going to take you longer to get that project done. It's going to be more complicated to get that project done. And it's probably going to cost you a lot more money to get that project done as well. In the private sector, you can do it a lot quicker. And so there's not quite as much frustration because of that lack of red tape. So I would agree with that. Also, it's a much easier process to provide these perquisites of the office in the private sector than it is in the public sector. So I would agree with that, Cynthia. I would say that, these differences in motivation oftentimes are just kind of par for the course in terms of the nature of working in the public sector as compared to working in the private sector. Herb Simon, who I'm sure you have run into before in this program, at least I hope you've run into him before. Herb Simon is all over the public administration literature. But Herb Simon kind of dips his toe in this idea of incentives and motivation as well. And he talks to us about the types of incentives that appeal to employees versus the types of incentives that appeal to employers. Simon says, I know I said that, but Simon says that the types of incentives that appeal to employees are things like money, compensation, prestige, social types of opportunities, promotional types of opportunities. Those are what Simon considers to be employee based incentives. For employers, the primary incentive is much more power and authority. So going back to McClellan's models of motivation, this is what McClellan told us as well, that employers, leaders, and managers tend to be more motivated by power and authority as opposed to being motivated by these more employee-based types of incentives. And then to add one more nuance into this discussion of incentives, we also have to think about the employee themselves and the type of employee that we are dealing with. Anthony Downs, who also is found all over the public administration literature, tells us about these things called bureau ideologies. So Downs argues to us that there are different types of employees who work in government agencies. And he breaks it down into 5 different, what he calls bureau ideologies, basically 5 different classifications, if you will, of employees. He says there are climbers, there are conservers, there are zealots, there are advocates, and there are, he said statesmen, but statespeople, if you'd like to call it that. He was writing back in the 1960s, obviously, but he said statesmen. Climbers are those younger employees who have not been in the organization very long, who are very ambitious and want to move up the organizational ladder. Conservers are employees who have been in the organization for a long period of time. And going back to this idea of the perks of the job, they have accumulated some of those perks of the job. And so they want to keep those perks. Then you have zealots. Zealots are employees who are very much focused on one issue. They are zealots for this one issue. Then you have what are called advocates. Advocates are more promoters of their unit or their department. So they're more, I'm going to fight for the benefit of my department. So I'm going to fight for public policy administration to try and get all the resources I can and all the recognition I can for the Department of Public Policy Administration. I'm an advocate for my department. And then there are what are called statesmen. Statesmen are these employees who are there for the general welfare, for the benefit of society. So they see themselves as really working in the public interest. Well, so what? So you've got these 5 different bureau ideologies, these 5 different types of employees. What does this then mean for motivation? According to Downs, when you are dealing with climbers, the types of incentives that will motivate those climbers will be opportunities for promotion through the organization. So if they see promotional opportunities, that will motivate them to work harder, that will motivate them to remain in the organization. Because that's what they want to do, is they want to promote upward. If they do not see those promotional opportunities, if they're not apparent to them, these climbers are then going to engage in what Downs calls jumping. They are going to jump to another organization that will provide them with those promotional opportunities. So you want to motivate a climber, you motivate them with promotional opportunities. Conservers are motivated by keeping the incentives that they have already accumulated. So, they might have, they like their title, they like the office that they have, they like their parking spot, whatever the case may be. Those are the perks of office that they have accumulated over the years, and they are motivated to try and keep those perks of the office. So those conservatives are motivated by trying to maintain the status quo and the way things have always been. Zealots, because they are big believers in one issue or one policy, they are motivated by trying to develop resources to support that one issue or that one policy. And so that's how you motivate a zealot. Advocates, because they are advocates for their department or their division, they are motivated by what is in the best interest of their department or their division. So they're motivated by increasing the budget of their department. And they're motivated by getting recognitions for their department. We have a college in my university, and it's called CPACE, and it's a College of Professional and Continuing Education. And anytime anyone who teaches in that college gets a recognition, they will do a big article on them, and they will, send out an announcement to the entire university, because that's the way in which they're advocating for their college. They are advocates for their college. And then with the statespeople, they are motivated by the public interest. So they'll be motivated by, if you can demonstrate to them how what they are doing, and by putting forth this effort, it is going to benefit the public interest, that's how you will motivate these statespeople. So the importance of Anthony Downs and these bureau ideologies is that there are different sets of incentives that will work better for different categories of employees. Once again, emphasizing that in motivation, there is no one size fits all approach. If you are very interested in the idea of incentives and motivation in the public sector, a couple people who I would point you toward. One person is James Perry. I'll put that in text, yeah, James Perry. And Perry has really devoted most of his career to studying incentives and the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic incentives and the impacts of these incentives on the motivations of public employees. Another person who he has published with a lot that you may want to take a look at is someone by the name of Ed Kellogg, out of the University of Georgia. He's actually a graduate of my alma mater, went through my alma mater about 15 years before me, but had the same dissertation chair that I had. So as I was working on my dissertation, I was always be told by a dissertation chair, Ed Kellogg didn't do it that way. So I was always held to the Ed Kellogg standard. But he's also a very well-known researcher who looks at extrinsic and intrinsic incentives and the impacts of those incentives on public sector employee motivation. So just if you're interested in that relationship between incentives and motivation, those are two good authors to take a look at. So up to this point in time, we have talked a lot about motivation, primarily about motivation. We've talked about these different motivational theories and how they apply differently in different situations. So at this point, I know that it's already 7:23, so we might have to truncate this a little bit. But in the time that we have remaining, let's apply this to our organizations. And so in this version of our breakout groups, I want each group to look at your organization or organization that you're interested in, and then identify the motivational strategies that you see at play in your organization. So do you see any expectancy theory? Do you see goal setting theory? What types of theories do you tend to see used in your organization? And then, as always, select a spokesperson. We will try and reconvene relatively quickly tonight because we don't have a whole lot of time. So let's say we will do about let's say we'll do about 20 minutes in our breakout groups, if that's okay. Reconvene, see what the groups came up with, and then we'll get out early tonight since we didn't have a break. So let's just spend about 20 minutes in our groups. But before we can do that, I have to create the groups. So let me go ahead and create them. See, 35 people. So we'll go with our normal 5 groups again. I think that has worked out well before. So let me create those groups. All right, the groups are created. So open up the rooms, go on into the group, spend about 20 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and see what types of motivational strategies and theories you see used in your organizations. So open up the rooms and then you can be on your way. Rooms are open. Okay. I think we should all be back in the main room now, hopefully. I'm gonna close out all the rooms. So I know we're running short on time. I apologize for that. I talked a little bit too much tonight, but let's go ahead and see what you came up with. Room number one.
Okay, so this is what we came up with. Individuals in group number one work under the mental health agency, mental health department, also Department of Public and Social Services, and also a nonprofit healthcare organizations. And as far as identifying the motivational theories underneath within the departments that we work for or organizations, in Santa Barbara County, they offer training and development as part of motivation. And this falls under the content theory motivation, as it can add value to the individual's experience and promotion. Also, we identified that DPSS, when they do initial hiring, they offer really great benefit packets, monthly stipends, and educational incentives. This is underneath the LA County, which is very highly competitive and may not be offered in other counties, these great benefits. So this falls under the expectancy theory based on performance, pay, job security, promotion, and incentives. We've also identified that some of these organizations offer telecommuting, so working from home, which also falls underneath the expectancy theory. This is based on department. It bases their flexibility or what they offer as far as telecommuting. And this theory is based on the also work ethics and performance of the individual. We also identified that in DPSS, the Maslow hierarchy of needs theory is as part of that department because of it meets the individual's own needs. Recognizing recognition and rewards is important for motivation, and the organization provides an employee wellness program. And then lastly, we talked about amongst ourselves on some of these organizations will offer several different type of motivational theories, or they go based off several different motivational theories. And perhaps some employees, as myself, may not be able to identify a specific motivational theory within the organization. Perhaps it's because the organization is not promoting it out like a theory, and it's a little more digging to figure out what style that our organization offers.
Thank you. And that's a great point. Yeah. Or organizations usually don't come out and say, oh, this is our motivational theory that we are using. And they'll use a multitude depending upon what unit or division or department. So it does take some digging to figure out what they're actually using. And the telecommuting one is I'm going to try not to talk too much. That telecommuting one is a really interesting one. And we saw that when we went into the COVID period, a lot of organizations said, that if you maintain your current level of productivity and you can demonstrate that you're putting in the effort working from home, then you're allowed to telecommute. And now we see some organizations pulling back on that and saying, well, no, we want you to be physically on campus, we want you physically to be in the organization. And the problem with that is, again, like you said, expectancy theory. You have created this expectation of instrumentality that this is a benefit, this is an outcome that you will get if you continue to maintain your high levels of performance, and that's being taken away. And so that certainly can have a very negative impact upon motivation if organizations continue to do that kind of return to the physical office. Very good. Interesting. Well done. Room number two.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm taking over for group number two. So So from the group that we have various areas of expertise. There are people in public sector. We have in the police department, in the VA, hospital section, there's a nonprofit, and then other specific areas. From what I'm noticing in our group, it was kind of split in the middle between process and content theories. Most of the people who were in public organizations were process theory people, and the nonprofit and other were in the content theory area. So for process theory, we had some folks talk about expectancy theory. For example, in the VA, I work in research, and there's a lot of evidence-based theories and research where we expect certain outcomes. So we have a lot of literature that focuses on that kind of expected outcome. For the police public sector, that we're looking at the goals theory, Locke's theory on goals, and that stating that some of these difficult goals lead to higher performance. There are goals that pertain to making the department successful for long periods of time, like retention and bonuses, educational training and development that motivates officers to stay employed in the city. So that was the goals. And then we have Hertzberg's two-factor theory for one person who is in a hospital organization, saying that self-motivation and recognition programs help with patient experience, and then the high ratings in the organization get more rewarded. And then lastly, we have a nonprofit organization that dealt with motivational achievement, McClellan's motivational theory. I think that's all we have.
Okay, great, very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we do see, some nonprofit organizations, you probably would see much more of an achievement type of motivator than you would authority and power or anything like that, because oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, sometimes the salary scales are a little bit lower, and so the motivation for working in a nonprofit organization is certainly to benefit society, and then it's more of that type of intrinsic type of motivator. So I think it was very interesting to see that different types of organizations. Some organizations, as you said, focus more on content. Some organizations focus more on process models, and it just really underscores that whole point that we made, that there's no one universal motivational theory. There's no one size fits all type of an approach. So thank you very much. Very good. Route number 3.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself. This is Jackie, so I'll go ahead and speak on behalf of group number 3. So we discussed several theories. Several of us worked in private, public, and nonprofit. One of the folks talked about Simon theory. She shared that her employer, for example, gives employee incentives for participation. Some of the examples were salary increases, status changes, and prestige and promotion opportunities. Another person that works with city council gave the example of goal setting theory. In her example, she said that under a city council manager form of government where city council sets policies and priorities and appoints the city manager to direct staff on bringing their visions to life. So they operate under that control. And then under DPSS, someone shared that their organization usually they see the Downs theory. There's different types of motivations among the employees. Some of them also feel they feel more comfortable being where they're at, and they don't want to move up. They just like where they're at. And for my organization, I shared I must probably kill the name, but McLean's needs theory. So I work in private, and from what I noticed under the tech industry, which is my department that I work for, most folks have a need for achievement and they like control of the situation. Some of them prefer to work independent, but there's also a need for them to work with groups in order to build relationships. Some of them also like to be like to win the arguments because they have to convince people to about their product and to buy it or use it. Another theory that we all liked was that we agreed that we see in our industry is the Maslow hierarchy of needs as well. Seeing that the majority of the organizations focus on the psychological needs, safety and security, as well as self-actualization. And that's it.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much. And yeah, I really like Down's approach to the Bureau ideologies because I see a lot of that. I've been in higher education for 28 years now, and I see a lot of it, especially in terms of climbers and conservers. Younger faculty tend to fall more in the climber category. Older faculty like me, I think we might fit more in the conserver type of category. And I think a lot of that revolves around acquisition of tenure and so I see a lot of that climber versus conserver in academic institutions. I think that's pretty common in a lot of our organizations. So thank you, Jackie. Well done. Room number 4.
Hi, everyone. Group number 4 noticed that content-based theories were very prevalent within our organizations. We also noticed that the majority of our organizations fell in line with theory Y. For example, someone shared that within their organization, they utilized training to obtain skills and knowledge beyond organizational mandates. One group member mentioned how there are people within their department that like to take extra trainings and learn new skills that would allow them to be more confident in what they're doing and to use these skills towards promotions. Another group member from a different organization noticed McClellan's achievement motivation by accomplishing goals. And one of our group members mentioned that even though, or that within the organization, even though we may not always succeed, they still made an effort to acknowledge another team member's success. And another one of our group members mentioned Hertzberg's 2-factor theory. And within their organization, there were not a lot of incentives or rewards offered within their organization that would motivate employees to go a step above their normal tasks, for example, with doing extra trainings or participating in organizational tasks. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we see a commonality between room 1 and room 4 in terms of training and development. It's good to see organizations going beyond the basic mandate for training and development. That training and development, those opportunities certainly can be a motivator, and they certainly do fit very well into this whole idea of achievement and providing the resources necessary for people to grow as individuals and to really hone their skills and do the types of things they want to do to move up in the organization. So it's interesting to see that as a common point between those 2 rooms. So excellent. Thank you very much. And finally, room number 5.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking for my group. So in my group, we had a mix of individuals that work in the private sector and the public sector. For the individuals in the private sector, one thing that they noticed was that their organization used monetary incentives. Basically, when an employee made a certain amount of sales, they would receive more of a compensation. So everybody was driven to work harder to get a bigger reward. And then for the individuals that worked in the public sector, their organizations they saw more of like a social learning theory, where individuals were motivated by the behaviors of leaders in the organization. So they would try to imitate their behaviors to get that motivation to become successful. And then another theory that we looked at was goal setting theory. That was common theory that we all saw that our organizations were using goals to motivate employees to become successful. For example, some organizations set like monthly metrics, to increase like patient satisfaction. And then if they met their goal, they would get like a reward or like a party, not a party, but like they'll buy lunch for them, or they'll get recognition for reaching that milestone. And yeah, that was pretty much it.
Very well done. Thank you. And it's always good when we have this mixture of some folks from the private sector, some folks from the public sector, and you can really kind of see those differences in motivational theories, especially is between extrinsic types of motivators, extrinsic incentives versus intrinsic incentives. So it's always nice to have that variability, if you will, in terms of the sectors in which people work in. And I think goal setting happens in all organizations. Just some organizations are just not as upfront about it. They don't talk about it quite as much as other organizations, but the establishment of those goals are extremely important for motivation, really galvanizing efforts of our employees working toward making our organizations effective. So there's more there, but I know we're after 8 o'clock, so I'll stop. But thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Again, I think that it's always good to, once we present these theories, to then have this opportunity to then apply them to our organizations and breakout groups. I think that's a nice approach to kind of find this nexus between theory and practice. Okay, we are past our time, so I will stop there. Next week, we're going to move into discussion of leadership, and I know you had an organization leadership course in the program, so you're probably going to be relatively conversant in a lot of these leadership theories. Next week is we're going to look at leadership, obviously in the context of organizational effectiveness. And so we'll go through some leadership strategies, some leadership theories, and talk about what they mean then for the effectiveness of an organization. Then what I'm planning then is for what will be our final session, week 8, as I told you. We get through all of our information and leadership next week. Then for week 8, we'll just kind of reserve that as time for you to work on your chosen solution paper and to kind of wrap up your assignments for the course, and kind of use that time for you to finish up your assignments. And that's if we get through everything we need to next week. So, and I think that will not be much of an issue. I think we'll be able to do that relatively easily. Okay, I'll shut up now. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. So take care.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.